You can start just shortly here. I guess quickly we can do a round of introductions. I want to thank everybody for joining us, folks who are on now, and then to our future viewers as well who are seeing this on our website. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to go over some of the research, the findings from the team that we have here. I will go ahead and, since we have a full panelist room, allow everybody to briefly introduce themselves, what organization they're here working from, and yeah, just a little bit about themselves, or just the basics. So I will pass it to you first, Cameron.
Thanks, Duncan. I'm Cameron Anglim. I'm an assistant professor of education policy and equity here in the St. Louis University School of Education.
Hi, I'm Anita Mannion, and I'm an assistant professor in political science at the University of Missouri, St. Louis.
Hi, I'm Sapna Barkey. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Family Medicine at UNC School of Medicine, and also director of research and evaluation in School of Medicine's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
Well, thank you so much for all of you joining us today. I really appreciate it. Cameron, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen now, let's jump right into it. So today we will have a presentation of the findings from a PRIME-supported paper called In Search of Teachers and Data. And yeah, Cameron, I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Duncan. So this is in search of teachers and data, 4-day school weeks, and school staffing shortages. I am supported with my excellent colleagues here, Anita and Sapna. So thank you very much for joining us. So just a brief agenda about what we'll discuss today. This is part of some overarching work that the three of us and others are engaged in here in Missouri, and definitely touches on both 4-day school week related issues and broader issues related to teacher labor markets in the state and pandemic and post-pandemic circumstances as well. We'll begin by discussing the growth of 4-day school weeks here in the state. A quick description: the growth has been enormous, large and rapid in many areas of the state, increasing numbers every single year. We'll talk about the motivation for why districts typically pursue the policy. Preview: it centers on teacher labor markets, and in many instances, specifically on pandemic-era staffing shortage challenges. We'll talk a little bit about evidence on 4-day school week impacts on teacher shortages. And in this section, devote about equal attention to the data limitations here in Missouri, which effectively prevent us from addressing this question as fully as we or any researcher would ideally like to. And then we'll talk a little bit about some future research objectives. This is an opportune time to be having these discussions. I'm leaving on Thursday for a 4-day school week centric conference in Oregon with a couple folks here from Missouri. So 4-day school weeks are growing in relevance both here in our state and across the country as well. So I can't say this definitively, but my anecdotal assessment pegs 4-day school weeks as perhaps the fastest growing education policy across the state of Missouri. Missouri is the fastest growing context, I believe, across the country. And what does that mean in terms of numbers? In the current school year, 161 out of Missouri's 516 traditional public school districts operate a 4-day school week. Those are numbers compiled by the absolutely tireless Dr. John Turner at Missouri State University. John puts more miles on his truck than I think anybody else in the state visiting each one of these districts, and is intimately knowledgeable about the kind of on-the-ground operations, superintendent relationships, et cetera. And so we're beholden to John for a lot of this work. The way the policy came into place in Missouri is a little bit different than some states in the Mountain West, for example. About 15 or so years ago, the state made a slight tweak to some of its regulations, which mandated, instead of a total number of days a year, a total number of instructional hours a year, which in effect enabled districts to change their schedules to accommodate 4-day school weeks, typically extending those 4 days into longer school days, and then foregoing 1 day a week, typically Mondays, whereas other states that have these policies, typically it's a Friday. In terms of where these districts currently operate across our state, the vast majority of them, 90+%, are in the state's rural regions. So we see 145 there. 14 are in what are known as town geographic areas. These are areas that are somewhat similar to rural districts, certainly not suburban or urban, and then a limited number in suburban and none to date in urban classified districts across the state. About 15% or so, but 21 districts are K-8 exclusive. So these are districts where high school students would attend perhaps a neighboring school district or some type of alternative arrangement. Enrollment tends to fall on the smaller side, though there is wide heterogeneity, especially now in the current school year. So on average, these are districts that enroll just over 1,150 students, but that average is a little bit misleading. The range, I think, is a bit more instructive. These range from tiny districts, a few dozen students, to one of the largest districts in the state as of this year, the Independence School District in suburban Kansas City. So that mean average figure, a little bit misleading. Most of these districts tend to be low enrolled districts. I highlight 4-day school week average teacher salaries. Anyone familiar with a 4-day school week, anyone familiar with Missouri's teacher compensation landscape is well aware that we pay teachers among the lowest of any state in the country, the lowest by certain metrics, including starting teacher salary. Teachers in 4-day school week districts, the district level average salary is just over $40,000 per year. I'll come back to that topic just in a little bit. It's impossible, in essence, to separate 4-day school weeks from our teacher compensation landscape in the state. So looking at growth over time, so I just mentioned roughly 15 years ago, this policy was made legal by that rules tweak. Initial adoption of 4-day school week policies by school districts was fairly slow. So we see kind of in those post-pandemic, post-Great Recession school years, there were a few districts, maybe 15 by the 2015-2016 school year. Whereas in the years preceding and during the pandemic, those numbers have catapulted, both in terms of the number of districts, which is measured in those teal bars. We're up to 161 districts, or 31% of districts across the state. And then in terms of total student enrollment in that kind of brown gold line there, almost 100,000 students in the state, which constitutes roughly 11% of the state's PK-12 student enrollment. Okay, so whereas 5, 6, 7 years ago, this was a small policy, still relevant, but not perhaps something that should garner enormous state level attention, that has very much shifted with more than 1 in 10 students across the state enrolled in one of these types of districts. In terms of the geography across the state, on the map here, we've got 4 different kind of categorizations of states. The white are districts that remain 5-day, whereas these shades of blue, the lightest shade of blue, are districts that have chosen to start the policy this year. That includes Independence School District outside Kansas City. The medium blue are those that adopted over the pandemic. So the 2021 school year, 21-22 school year, and the 19-20 school year. And then pre-pandemic. So those that predated the onset of the pandemic. Okay. So there are 2 things that kind of jump out to me, at least, in this map. One, I'm sitting here today in St. Louis City. You'll notice that in the St. Louis region, in the eastern portion of our state, and similarly, though with the Independence School District exception, the Kansas City region on the western portion of the state, very few, if any, districts have pursued 4-day school weeks. So this has yet to reach many of the urban cores of our state. which is not dissimilar to the national landscape. But that's one thing that jumps out. The other thing that jumps out, which perhaps might catch your eye first, is that districts tend to cluster near one another in terms of their 4-day school week policy adoption. Now, those of us that study teacher labor markets, this might not be all that surprising. Teacher labor markets don't tend to operate in huge swaths of land or huge areas statewide, perhaps. Instead, they tend to operate much more locally. So where we see districts adopting 4-day school weeks, odds are that there is a district adjacent or very nearby, or many districts adjacent or nearby, that have already adopted a 4-day school week. This makes sense if you're thinking about teacher movement. A teacher who is switching jobs or switching school districts is perhaps more likely to switch to a nearby district than to move 200, 300, 500 miles away across the state's geography. So just kind of spending a minute or two on why districts are pursuing this very quickly growing policy. About 10, 12 years ago, districts would have most commonly cited financial pressure, fiscal constraint, okay, as a rationale for 4-day school week adoption, particularly in the wake of the Great Recession. If you're familiar with the school finance literature or just general finance administration following the Great Recession, districts were financially strapped. State revenues declined precipitously, and district expenditures declined similarly, particularly those districts that are most reliant on state aid for their revenues. So districts, 10, 12 years ago, there were only a few of them, but tended to cite financial cost savings. However, in more recent years, as evidence on the effectiveness of those policies, financially motivated policies, started to emerge, it was uncovered that districts were only saving on the order of roughly 1% to 2% of their budgets to pursue this policy. That's not a tremendous amount of money. I don't want to say that that's nothing, particularly for a district that is kind of a cash strap, so to speak. But we're certainly not saving 20% of district budgets. Now, 20% represents 1 day a week. Why might that be? Well, a district foregoing 1 day a week can't reduce its expenditures in a commensurate fashion. So it's not firing 20% of its staff, for instance, 20% of its teachers. It might save on student transportation costs for a day, food service for a day, custodial services for a day, keeping the electricity on, although I imagine electricity still remains on for that 5th day, at least to some extent, okay? So the cost savings tend to be on those items on the margins, not for huge line item expenditures. Okay. On the other hand, evidence has begun to emerge across the country. The most rigorous evidence on student achievement has come from states including Oklahoma and Oregon, from excellent researchers including Emily Morton and Paul Thompson. Students on average have suffered from the adoption of 4-day school weeks. Not all students, and not in every context, but average student outcomes have declined, particularly in non-rural settings. Again, most of these districts are in rural settings, but particularly in non-rural settings, and particularly among girls. And what concerns me perhaps the most is that there's some indication that these negative effects might accumulate over time and worsen over time. In many of these contexts, we haven't seen long-term effects yet because the policy hasn't been in place for the long term, including here in Missouri. But that's something that worries me as we might look 2, 3, 10 years down the line, especially in the context of expiring pandemic-era stimulus aid. 7, 8, 9 years ago, we saw precipitous achievement declines after federal aid expired after the Great Recession. I'm very hopeful that that does not continue this time around, but realistic enough to know that it's a very real possibility. In 4-day school week districts in our state, I, along with a grad student at St. Louis University, Aaron Park, have found that those districts that tend to pursue 4-day school weeks are those whose average teacher salaries lag those of neighboring districts by on the order of $2,000 to $4,000 per teacher, or roughly 5% to 10% of their salaries. Now, recall that districts that adopt 4-day school weeks tend to be located near other districts that have already pursued these policies. So these adjacent salary conversations are very relevant. If a district cannot offer improved compensation to its teachers, they might theorize that perhaps the next best thing, or a next thing they could offer their teachers, is some other type of benefit, in this case, a non-pecuniary benefit, something to do with the kind of non-financial aspects of their lives. Now, one fewer day of work a week might be one of those policies, but I would caution that just because students are attending 4 days a week doesn't mean that for every week a teacher is only attending 4 days a week. Some of those days are used for extended professional development or other types of opportunities, but still some type of additional benefit to attract and retain teachers in circumstances, contexts where improved compensation proves challenging or perhaps impossible. Again, recall, Missouri teacher salaries are among the lowest in the nation on average. Some districts might buck that trend, but on average, we have some of the lowest teacher salaries of any state in the nation. I think it's worthwhile reviewing the efficacy of these policies in terms of how they affect teachers. But first, getting a sense of whether these policies tend to be popular among the voting public and public at large. My first thoughts when I learned and continue to learn about this policy, or what do families think? What do voters think? How do local communities think about these policies? What happens on that fifth day? Adjustments might need to be made in terms of childcare. I have an 8-month-old at home who very much goes to daycare 5 days a week. That fifth day would prove very challenging. Okay, so this is some data from SLU Poll, a group I'm a part of here at St. Louis University. We partner with the National Polling Service, YouGov, to conduct polling on a whole host of issues related to things like politics, but also education policy plays a very large role in SLU Poll. This is data from roughly 9 months ago, where we surveyed likely voters across the state on their opinions on the permanent reduction of 5 to 4 day school weeks in their local school districts. Opposition outstripped support across the board in terms of political ideology. Okay, so roughly 3 to 3.5 folks out of 10 favor these policies, whereas 4 to 5 out of 10 do not favor these types of policies. Okay, a full 2 in 10 remain unsure. I would venture that those folks are more than likely reside in areas where these policies are less prevalent. But again, I think it's important to keep in mind that these policies in Missouri, despite their rapid growth, don't tend to garner robust support among the voting public. I compared that to some national work that Anita and Sapna and I did recently, and this was published through the Brookings Institute just last month. 4-day school weeks, while slightly more popular in a survey we posed to the national public, remained the least popular among 4 sample policies to improve teacher workforce issues. And those other policies included one-time bonuses, grants to teach in high-need schools, and accelerated and expanded loan forgiveness specific to teachers. Okay, so though we see 4-day school week policy support slightly higher here than we did in a Missouri-specific example, I do think it remains important to note that this was the least popular among the 4 policies that we posed to a group of national individuals. This survey took place roughly a year ago to 11 months ago. One other note from the national work, and this might not surprise folks who are in tune with kind of the politicalization, polarization that is popular, become popular in education policy these days. There were enormous partisan differences. in our national survey work. Whereas liberals tend to support policies across the board to support the teacher workforce, conservatives tend to be much less supportive of these types of policies, and specifically less supportive of 4-day school week policies. Only about 1 in 4 conservatives indicated support for 4-day school week policies, which was near the least, not quite the least, near the least of these 4 policies. Whereas we see in the news how political loan forgiveness is. All you have to do is turn on the 5 o'clock news most nights of the week to see that. You might not necessarily think that 4-day school weeks garner quite as much polarization, particularly given that 4-day school week policies in Missouri and elsewhere tend to operate most frequently in more conservative areas of the state, in more rural areas of the state. So it's a bit of a paradox here, where liberals tend to be more supportive of all these policies and conservatives less so, which bears out with respect to 4-day school weeks specifically as well. Okay. So we come back to this question. 4-day school weeks have exploded in popularity across the state. Remember, it's over 30% of districts, over 10% of students. They're being pursued now most specifically related to trying to ease teacher shortages, trying to lessen teacher turnover. Is there robust, systematic evidence that these policies have helped? The very short answer is no. There is no current definitive evidence that says this. Anita and Sapna some years ago were some of the first to try to dig into some of this work specific to recruitment issues. But there's very little, if any, systematic evidence. So when we sought to commence this project, we wanted to do so and look particularly at areas where teacher shortages tend to be the most acute. That often is in areas like STEM and special education, which tend to be harder to staff areas. And we also wanted to kind of investigate, are these shortages most impactful, largest in areas where teacher compensation is the worst? Again, recalling that teacher compensation in Missouri is nothing, nothing to emulate. So we wanted to do so to look at both the short and the long-term effects on school staffing shortages in terms of district 4-day school week policy adoption. Yet we're unable to do so fully in a way that we can provide hard evidence on this issue. And I'm going to outline 2 reasons why that's the case, which bears not just on 4-day school week research, but frankly, teacher labor market research across our state on any given topic. Okay. The first is that the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education tends to release to researchers like ourselves school staffing data a bit later to much later than many other states across the country. So for example, we do not yet have 2022-23 teacher staffing data from which we could calculate things like year-over-year teacher turnover, year-over-year teacher departures from schools. So I cannot definitively say X% of teachers left their school districts leading into not this year, but last school year. And I doubly can't say how many teachers left leading into this current school year. So why is that important? Well, if we are going to craft policies to help the teacher labor force in Missouri, we would best do so with the most contemporary recent data. And at present, we're not really able to do that. The second issue, which is even more salient for issues related to staffing shortages, is that Missouri does not mandate that districts report staffing shortages. That was extremely surprising for me to learn when I started this project. So for example, between 2008, 2009 to the 21-22 school years, only between just over half and in some years as many as almost 90% of districts reported shortage data each school year. Okay, so in any given year, we only see between 5 and 9 out of 10 districts report that shortage data. And moreover, districts might be inconsistent in their reporting, or there might be districts that are wholesale absent from the data in every single school year. Now, that doesn't mean that those districts don't know some of these figures locally, but it completely prevents folks like us from making statewide claims. Say, for example, does the 4-day school week reduce teacher shortages? It restricts our ability to do so, and really renders our ability to say anything definitive about teacher shortages essentially null in a way that doesn't have kind of huge caveats, huge asterisks attached to it. So moving forward, I would love to see that these two issues at least get addressed for future school years. It would really make our ability to be nimble and evaluate policies and as near real time as possible much easier. So I would implore the state to strategize ways that might improve on these two issues. With the data we do have in hand, which again I need to caution is quite limited. With the data we do have in hand, we observe that teacher shortages in 4-day school week districts tend to be much larger, on the order of twice as large as in 5-day school day districts. Now, the huge caveat to that is we cannot say 4-day school weeks cause larger staffing shortages, okay? A very real scenario could be that those districts that adopt 4-day school weeks are those districts that already had larger shortages, okay? Or that have particular staffing challenges or other characteristics, particularly low teacher salaries that cause shortages, okay? So this in no way is saying 4-day adoption of 4-day school weeks causes larger shortages, but just simply, at any given percentile of shortages. So at the 10th percentile, these are districts that have the fewest shortages per 100 students. So something like, 0.1 positions per 100 students, all the way up to the 90th percentile. These are folks that have between 1 and 2 vacant positions per 100 students. That's really substantial. Across both 5 and 4-day school week districts, we can't say things definitive like 4-day school weeks cause larger staffing shortages, but we do see that these 4-day school week districts are encountering particularly acute staffing shortages in their districts, particularly in recent years. This right here is 21-22 data. I would expect this to be even sharper in the 22-23 school year. On the topic of teacher shortages, the same caveats apply as the last slide. We are not and cannot indicate that 4-day school weeks cause higher teacher turnover, but we do see that more folks leave their positions in 4-day school weeks year over year, every year, than do districts that operate 5 days a week. And that's both districts that operate 5 days a week across the state and districts that operate 5 days a week in rural locations only, okay? We're calling that roughly 90+% of 4-day school week districts in Missouri are in rural locales, okay? So in 4-day school week districts, between 10 and 15, upwards of 16% of teachers leave their positions in any given year. And you'll note two things. One, a sharp reduction in that in the first year of the pandemic, and then an even sharper increase in that in the second year of the pandemic, okay? Now, again, we don't have 22-23 teacher data yet. The full expectation is that that almost 16% figure will be even higher in 22-23 if Missouri is anything like virtually any of the other states across the country. Okay. Now, I couldn't comment or speculate on the difference between 4-day and 5-day districts in 22-23. I would not necessarily expect that gap to have shrunk. But 4-day districts are operating in circumstances that are enormously challenging. You think about the last slide, they've got larger teacher shortages. Think about this slide, that those shortages could be produced in part by more significant year-over-year teacher turnover, and these things are at their worst right now. Okay, so we've got this confluence of events happening right now, where we've got low teacher salaries, really heightened teacher shortages, higher teacher turnover, all of which occur more acutely in 4-day school week districts. So it's a confluence of events that makes me extremely sympathetic to those that work in these contexts, their superintendents, their teachers, their students, their families. And it's one I hope reverses in the coming years, though again, the financial situation in these districts renders that perhaps unlikely, but again, I'm hopeful. Okay. Moving forward, there are some things that we'd like to better understand. 4-day school weeks, again, are expanding really rapidly, including to some non-rural areas. 2 districts that are of particular interest to me and my team include the Independence School District. Again, I've mentioned that several times thus far, in suburban Kansas City, 14-ish thousand students. It's a much more racially and ethnically diverse group of students and educators than many of the areas across the state. So that's an area of particular concern and interest. And in the suburban St. Louis region, a single middle school in the Hazelwood district has begun a 4-day school week for teachers, where students will remain in class 5 days a week. The 5th day focused on some career and technical education exploration. This is being trialed in Hazelwood. So these 2 contexts here are enormously interesting, not just because they're in not the typical kind of rural settings, but also because they're unique in other factors. Independence being one of the largest enrollments in the state. Hazelwood being extremely racially and ethnically different, diverse than many other areas across the state, and trying this kind of CTE-centric approach that is not necessarily prevalent in other areas of the state. So these are 2 districts, both of which starting their kind of maiden voyages with respect to 4-day school weeks this school year. 2 districts we're going to be keeping our eye on, in addition to the other contexts that we're seeing across the state. So I'll wrap up there. Again, this is part of a much larger kind of ongoing project. We are very appreciative of the Prime Center's support in this area. This is top of mind for me as I depart for Oregon on Thursday for a 4-day school week conference. And I'm in communication with folks in lots of states across the country, as this policy just quite simply does not seem to be slowing down. Instead, appears to be rapidly growing both in our state, Missouri, and in other states adjacent to Missouri and across the nation. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Cameron. I am super interested to hear about that conference. I wish you the best there, and I hope that that's a positive experience. I have one question myself, and for any of our participants on, if you would like to post a question either in the chat for everyone to see it, or if you want to post in the Q&A, also feel free to write that out in either of those forums. But myself, I'm curious, you mentioned sort of the data constraints that your team is facing in trying to gauge the effects that 4-day school week, or even the relationship that a 4-day school week might have with teacher shortages. I'm curious what type of teacher workforce data, sort of what would be your ideal if you could sort of say that, you know, these are the things that we're looking to learn, like this is what we want to be able to see what's happening. What types of data would you be looking for there to be able to try to glean the insights that you'd hope to be able to make?
That's a great question. So I've got a few responses to that. And before I do so, I want to plug a website that my partner in Kansas, Tuan Nguyen at Kansas State University, maintains. Tuan is one of the national experts on teacher shortages. He maintains a website constructed with a few others, including Paul Bruno at the University of Illinois, Josh Bleiberg at University of Pittsburgh, and a few other excellent folks. The website is teachershortages.com, simple to the point, and he is tracking the latest data nationally on teacher shortages. What I would love to see is the state requiring school districts to report teacher shortage data. that's first and foremost. Other requirements that I have or other suggestions that I have are all secondary to requiring the reporting of data. For example, I know for a fact through partnerships with other school districts within the state that there are districts that collect this data on their own, but do not report it to DESE. I don't quite know why that is the case. I want to be sensitive to the administrative burdens that more data reporting requirements might have on districts, particularly those districts that don't have dozens and dozens of staff and data staff, et cetera. If you're a district that serves 100, 200 students, you don't have 25 people working on data, right? So I want to be sensitive to that. On the other hand, our abilities to say things systematically across the state or draw inferences across the state are thwarted by not having this data in all 516 traditional public school districts. And I'd love to see this in charter school districts as well across the state. The second thing that I would love to see, which is present in the current data, but incomplete, is not just we've got X positions that are left unfilled or X positions that were filled, et cetera, but continuing to break down this data by position types, okay? So are we missing a high school calculus teacher, or maybe just a high school math teacher, maybe just a math teacher, okay? Instead of a teacher writ large, okay? Filling a math position, as I talk to superintendents across the state, is very unlike filling an elementary generalist position or a literacy position, et cetera. Filling a special education position is unlike filling other positions. Those are where we see the most acute shortages. And when I talk to superintendents across the state, I'm begging XYZ to come out of retirement to fill a position, or I'm unfortunately in the position where I need so-and-so to double up on particular positions, or I need so-and-so to teach out of subject. So a non-math teacher, a non-science teacher teaching in those areas. Those are tough realities on the ground that don't serve kids well. So I'm not saying that's the superintendent's fault necessarily, right? And the superintendent is doing all that they can. The school boards are doing what they can. Teachers most certainly are doing what they can. But these are realities that don't serve kids in the best ways that we can. Heightened, no doubt, by the fact that many of these teachers, despite having decades in some cases of experience, might earn $35,000 a year. Okay. That's not fair to the teachers, and it's doubly not fair to the students educated by those teachers. We can do better with the data to better uncover these types of things. We might know this anecdotally. Data helps us move past anecdote to kind of more systematic appraisals of these phenomena across the state.
Thank you for that answer, Cameron. And yeah, I think that it's helpful to sort of hear you lay out both the need, sort of the use cases for this data and what that data might look like. That is really the main question that was sticking with me after listening to your presentation. If there, I want to sort of leave space for if anybody has any other questions or things that they would like to share. But barring that, I mean, thank you so much for making the time to share a little bit about your work with us this afternoon. Like I said, this presentation will be available on our website for you to direct folks to. I'll make sure that everyone has a link. But I do really appreciate your work on this. We definitely at the Prime Center have learned a lot from seeing this, and we know that all our readers and our audience will learn from this too. I think that, like you really highlighted clearly, this is a growing and a more present issue. And so I think it's a good one for us to be thinking about. And I look forward to seeing the future work that you all do on this issue as well. So thank you again so much for you three for being here. And with that, I'll go ahead and wrap us up. So take care, everyone. And again, Cameron, good luck at your conference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.